Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Diane Davis, and I want to begin by acknowledging that the Harvard Graduate School of Design is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. As we do every time we have an event in here, we pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past, present, and future, and honor the land itself, which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. This school also recognizes the work of the Harvard University Native American program in cultivating the relationship that led to the creation of that formal acknowledgement. So now, I'm thrilled to be here as a moderator for this special event with Richard Sennett, a leading scholar of cities, about whom I will make a few introductory remarks before turning the podium over to him. Before doing so, let me also make a few brief announcements before my introduction. First, a quick reminder that we have live captioning available for our virtual audience, and there is a virtual audience. To enable captions, click the closed captioning icon at the bottom of the live stream window. And for our in-person audience, that's all of you, and I'm so happy you're here. Live captioning is available at the link or the QR code currently on screen. So please visit the AV booth back up there if you have any questions or need assistance. Second pre-announcement, the great programming at the GSD continues with a talk by my UPD colleague, Dan Stubegard, next Tuesday, April 9th. Dan will discuss his work and that of his firm, Kobe, in his lecture titled City as a Resource, Kobe's Current Works on the City. For more information and to see the lineup of presenters, please visit the GSD website. Third, and perhaps this is just an acknowledgement of the importance of Richard Sennett and his work, not just to those of us at the GSD, but also to many others in the country and elsewhere. I want to mention that the GSD will be publishing a series of 6 public lectures that Richard gave at the GSD back in the fall of 1981, all under the title of Democracy in Urban Form. And that publication is going to be timed to be released around the fall elections of 2024, where indeed democracy, even if not urban form, will undoubtedly be at stake. So I think that's really great, and I'm looking forward to being involved somehow in that if we have an event for that in the fall. Okay, so now to our main speaker. The fact that Richard has and continues to write about timely issues, like democracy and urban form, that engage all of society will be eminently clear when we turn it over to him to speak. But let me also give a proper introduction, laced with some of my own reflections and knowledge of Richard that speak to his sociological sensibilities and his capacities to connect the form and design of cities to how people actually live in and experience society. Richard Sennett began his life as a professional cellist and was trained at the Juilliard School in New York, where he worked with Klaus Adam, cellist of the Juilliard Quartet. Soon thereafter, and for a range of issues that I learned while reading his masterful new book, The Performer, including a hand injury, Richard left classical music performance and turned his attention to cities. That journey began, I would say, it seems to me, when he came to Harvard to study sociology, working with David Reisman in a department that was then known as social relations. Over there, right across the way from the GSD. With this sociological training, Richard embarked on a journey to actually physically, emotionally, intellectually explore cities, but initially with a focus on urban social life, changes in labor, and social theory. Among his initial books, which include The Hidden Injuries of Class, The Fall of Public Man, The Corrosion of Character, and The Culture of the New Capitalism. In all these books, he addresses those themes of social life, changes in labor, social theory in one way or another. Then in his later work, he combined his interest in cities with an appreciation for architecture and urban form, as represented by several books such as Flesh and Stone, The Craftsman, and Building and Dwelling. His newest book, which we will hear more about in a few minutes, continues to address sociological themes, but does so with a more purposeful examination of the relationship between life, art, and politics, and by so doing, returns Richard to his own artistic origins. Now, without chronologically dating Richard or me, let me say that as an undergraduate urban sociology major studying at Northwestern University in Chicago a gazillion years ago, I became fascinated by Richard's writings just as I began to study the Chicago School of Sociology, which happened a long time before I had the opportunity to meet him again at the GSD when he came to the UPD department as a guest lecturer, critic, and later as a distinguished lecturer. My story of how I got from sociology to the GSD is another story, but I would say that many of the thematics that have driven Richard's work, I've also played with in myself, and I'm very inspired by the great sociological work that he does that moves us through physical space and through cities. Now, one of the first books that I read as an urban sociology major ensconced in urban studies in the city of Chicago, that's why it's called the Chicago School of Sociology, was The Fall of Public Man, which used Chicago as a laboratory to study history, class, and urban transformation. When much later I found out that Richard grew up in one of Chicago's most renowned public housing projects, Cabrini Green, I was even more drawn to him and to the fact that he had this deep desire to understand what I might phrase as cities, class, and power, just to riff off my own doctoral advisor, Manuel Castells. But his approach came out of his own personal experience in that particular city. That seminal book also introduced many American scholars to the concepts and ideas of the public sphere, associated with the European sociologist Jürgen Habermas, who is known for his writings on that theme. And as a little aside, I want to say that now that I'm going to be heading the public's domain in MDes, Richard, you're going to have to come back next year, and we're going to use a lot of your writings and books in the seminar on publics. I later had the occasion to meet Richard in New York City once or twice, because I was teaching sociology and history at the New School for Social Research, and Richard was still at NYU. In preparation for today, I also learned that Richard had the opportunities to work independently with Hannah Arendt, who also graced the corridors of the graduate faculty, although many, many years before I joined the New School. And that was a place of critical reflection, thinking theoretically, philosophically, sociologically, and about cities and history. So again, the cycles of and the threads of our commonalities, even if we didn't write anything together, tie us to each other. But what I learned at the New School, and what is eminently clear in Richard's own writings, and in this marvelous new book, it really comes through, is the importance of situating our theoretical and conceptual knowledge of cities and how people live in them within an understanding of different social, political, and even philosophical traditions. Richard Sennett is a scholar who knows American pragmatism or pragmatic philosophy, but also European continental philosophy. He has worked and interacted with major thinkers of the 20th century and has lived and worked in many disciplinary, intellectual, and geographic domains his whole life, and it really comes through in the pages of this marvelous book. It is that remarkable intellectual and personal breadth that has made Richard Sennett one of the foremost scholars of cities and societies, and I want to underscore that, societies too, societal relations and norms. And another way to put it, he is a major interpreter of the interaction between urban form and the sociological underpinnings of individual and collective life. Again, all those things are in this book, and we'll hear about them. He returns to these themes in The Performer in ways that inform, educate, and delight, not just because of their conceptual and theoretical situation. I mean, the theorists that he mentions in here, my mind is still spinning, although I was happy to see Zimmel and Weber and all the sociologists along with the philosophers. But I also want to say that I think this book addresses these themes starting from his own personal vantage point as an artist who understands how performance on private and public stages, in theaters and streets, and in quotidian interactions, as well as national politics, make us who we are as urban citizens and members of a societal community. Lest I be remiss in not underscoring that it's not just me or the networked world of sociologists, urbanists, architects, and designers that have been so heavily influenced by Richard. I would like to underscore that he's the winner of multiple awards that signal his global stature, including the Hegel Prize, the Spinoza Prize, an honorary doctorate from Cambridge University, and the Centennial Medal from Harvard University, which I think you got 2 years ago. Last but not least, Richard currently serves as a member of the United Nations Committee on Urban Initiatives, and he's advised the UN on urban issues for the past 30 years. Richard Sennett is, in short, a man of astounding accomplishments. We're so fortunate to have him here with us tonight. And so, without further ado, and I really want to use the word ado, given your continued reference to Shakespeare in your book, it is my honor to present to you Richard Sennett.
Thank you very much. My life passed in front of my eyes. Well, it's as always, it's wonderful to be back at the GSD. The way I think we're going to work tonight is I'm going to talk for about 40 minutes. Is that right? And then we'll open it up to discussion, and I hope we can have some discussion. As Diane said, I've had a schizophrenic life. I was a cellist and then became an urbanist. That's either a decline or an increase, depending on how you think about that. But in any event, my life as a performing musician never really left me during the decades that I've been doing sociology. And in this book, I try and bring these two realms together, that is, of artistic performance and the life of cities. And that's what I'm going to talk to you about tonight. This isn't what I'm talking about tonight, isn't really in the book, although there are references to it, because I wanted to do something that was more explicitly architectural, that related to the shaping of performance in theatrical space, and what that has to do with the shaping of space generally. And I should say about this that there is a kind of, in my bailiwick, there's a kind of impulse always to tie art and life together. And I hope at the end of this short talk that what I can convey to you is that that's not entirely possible, that there are aporias between the art of performing in theaters and the life of the streets, which can't be bridged. And that has political implications, I think, which we can spell out. So, without further ado, let me start with this problem between stage and street, as I'm going to frame it, in a really simple way. There is an obvious problem here that has joined these two realms, which is the problem of dead streets. Because one of the easy solutions about bringing dead streets to life would be to, in a certain way, energize the street as a space of performance. The kind of death that this refers to is something like this, which is a public realm, or this, which is a domestic realm. These are spaces without any kind of expressive character in their own. And particularly when I was beginning as an urbanist, the notion was that somehow theater could do something about this problem. So a very early example of this, you probably all know this, is the Piazza d'Italia. Have you seen pictures of this before? Charles Moore, which was a space which was meant to bring all sorts of people into public and so on, absolutely dead space in itself. That is, it represented theater in all of its provocation, but gave people in the city no opportunity to do anything in it. All they could do is look at it. A more normal way of thinking about theater, or perhaps normal isn't the word, but a more practical way of thinking about it, is in terms of regeneration, as in this tourist-orientated theater represented by Faneuil Hall, in which the notion was that the kind of spectacle of the streets would draw people into it to consume. And that works more or less to draw in tourists. But the problem is exemplified by New York City for the people it doesn't draw in, which are basically native New Yorkers who avoid this theatrical space like the plague. People will walk around, take a 2 or 3 block detour to be free of this. Now, it looks like this wonderful, wonderful space, but only if you're in New York for a couple of days. So this is a kind of superficial problem that exists, that it's a theater without performances. You know, it's a representation of life rather than life itself. But at and the other thing I should say about this is that I think this impulse has been more successful in looking at the natural world in theatrical terms than it has been in terms of looking at street life. You all know this kind of move made by Olmsted in Central Park, whereby putting the cars below ground level, when you're actually in Central Park, the city has disappeared. You can hear it, and in the old days you could smell it too, because of course this was the horse route. But it is an illusion of nature, and a lot of the plantings are done in a way to be kind of self-dramatizing. A modern instance of that, of course, would be the High Line, which makes of these trays of plants a kind of spectacle that people walk through. And it's always seemed to me that at this kind of surface level, that landscape design is an inherently more theatrically endowed activity than the attempt to create a kind of, this kind of false, there we are, this kind of false sense of life in a city. So that's the superficial problem I want to look at. The deeper problem is that in the name of art, that theater and as aesthetics, theater withdraws from the city rather than creates a kind of representation, that there has been a kind of withdrawal of performativity from the world of the city. And this is a very, very old problem, and I'm just going to give you one example of it from the ancient world. Oh, here we are. This is the theater of Dionysius. It's an amphitheater that you can see all over Greece. One of them on this model existed in Athens called the Pnyx, and this was a space both in the 5th century in BC in Athens, a space both for theater and for politics. That is, that citizens would watch a show, and then they might have a debate about whether to go to war or not. And the same space served both. From the vantage point of what we want to talk about, is the relation of this kind of theater to nature. Originally, let me see if I can do this without putting anybody's eye out. I have an unfailing ability to not use these things. Originally, the citizens would sit here. They sat by the way, by local communities so that they could, if they roughhoused or whatever, they could be identified. And the speaker stood here at a bema. And beyond the speaker would have been just endless mountain and space. That there was no, this is a space in which the word, which can be reflected back here to be heard, exists in a kind of unmediated space in nature. Very different than, I'm going to try to get this thing to go back, than this, which is a completely mediated kind of spectacle of nature. Here, the word floats into space. And you have to imagine that people for hours and hours would be listening to words while staring at the mountains beyond them. In time, what happens is that these theaters develop a background called a skein, which was originally just a piece of cloth draped over a couple of poles, and then became a structure. And as this back structure developed, the relationship to nature was cut off. Why did it develop? Because people understood that by creating a backdrop to speech, they could reinforce it. And that at that point, the art of speaking took on another turn. It became tied to the existence of a kind of space which was not verbal, but had its own independent life. What do I mean by that? In a performance, the actors would be behind this stage, and in a performance, the actors who are impersonating gods would sit on the top of this skein and comment on the action below. People would come and go through these holes, which means that it's the beginning of something called appearance and disappearance, as we would think of it. And for the Greeks was the difference between being, which was out of space like this, and becoming, which is you suddenly entered into something and you could leave it as well. And that seemed to them magical. It was magical that you could do that. And so the kind of artifice of performing beyond words suddenly begins to make a kind of rift in the relations between nature and performance. By extension, that same rift begins to appear in the relation of these spaces to the city. And rather than spend 4 hours with you tonight describing that in ancient Athens, I want to do a huge move forward and show you how that rift played out in the beginnings of our own modernity in the late medieval period and early Renaissance. So we're making a kind of leap here between something which is the interposition between of art, between people's experience of space. We're making a huge leap to 1,500 years to our own time. And I should say, as one of those academic throat clearings to this, that in terms of ritual, this leap didn't appear. Religious rituals of this sort, which marked European cities from ancient times on, continued as pageants really up until the 20th century in some places, but very much in this spatial form in 18th century cities, up until 18th century cities. The difference between a ritual and a performance is that these choreographing of bodies and the host and so on have no single author. That is, there's something that's inherited. Oops, gosh, I'm so bad with these things. They're rituals which they modify over time, but the notion is that these are impersonal performances, whereas theater at this time begins to have the mark, particularly in spatial form, of individuals. We can see that in a kind of transition. This is the Globe Theater, Shakespeare's theater, and it's a transitional space. I don't know if you know how it works. There's a stage, it has a little balcony up here and here. This is all open, and then there's a round circle of seats. This is where the cheap seats were. This is where people who wanted to get out of the rain sat, paid more for it. But the important thing about this space is that it's still doing some of the function of the pre-Skene ancient theater. There is no scenery at all. There are very few props. So, for instance, if you were Cordelia and you were performing in King Lear, you'd have a withered piece of wood, and you'd have to treat that as representing a whole forest or a heath, and you'd have to manipulate that prop in a way that made people see a forest or a heath. So it's a space without without visual marking, which put on the performer a great deal of weight individually. You had to be a good performer to make somebody believe that holding up a piece of driftwood meant that you were Lear's daughter on the heath. And the same thing with the props like skulls and so on. So this is a transitional form. When you begin to get theatrical space, which we recognize as modern, you first get it in things like this. This is the Inigo Jones Banqueting Hall in London. And this is that's the king's space. All this were occupied courtiers. The performers would perform in the center here. And to create illusion, they put into little carts things like they'd put a picture of a heath. And that cart would come in as a little door over here, and it would come in, and it would circulate around. Everybody would go, oh, yes, it's a heath, and then it would exit. And the same thing with costumes. There were very elaborate costumes. It was a little like a catwalk in a modern, in a modern fashion show. People would display the costumes, being a devil, a satyr, or whatever. They'd wear the costumes, had hats and all sorts of feathers and so on, and then they'd walk off. So it is a space in which there is display, but the display is, it requires an active imagination, but there's a physical object which makes the display possible. Our problem, which is the real divide between the stage and street, begins in this building. This is the Teatro Olimpico in Vicenza. How many of you have been there? Oh, you should send them all. Give them plane tickets to Vicenza, just next to Venice. And what this is, I'll go on to the next slide. We'll give you an idea about it. The actual Teatro Olimpico it's in a very constricted piece of land, so it is very sharply raked stage, seats, and the stage is very compressed. But the thing about it that's amazing is this is, what you see through here is an idealized view of the city. These look like they're stage backcloths. They were actually, Palladio died in the middle of constructing this, and these backcloths were made by somebody named Scamozzi. And what they do is show, they're amazing, they're just plaster kind of frescoes, and they show an idealized view of the city, perfectly clean, orderly, from any place you looking outside into the street, you look into a space that's beautiful but unreal. And before this space, up here on the stage part of it, were usually performed tragedies, so that you're in a kind of dislocation between this idealized urban world and the kinds of dramas that are involved in murders and all of that happen up front here. You understand what I'm saying? You see somebody stabbed to death and you look beyond them and the city outside is peaceful and very beautifully colored and all of that. That's a dissociation, and it's intentional. It contrasts to the first drawings we have by Serlio of what spaces for drama look like in cities. And he makes a principal contrast between two. This is a tragic scene. This is what a city should look like if you're performing tragedy. And this is what it should look like if you're performing a comedy. The reason for this is that the notion is that tragedy takes us outside of ourselves. It's very disturbing. Evidently, it was very disturbing to Renaissance people when they saw this, because it has two, or at least two, maybe three, actually, vanishing points, so that the perspectives felt like you didn't know where the city ended. Here, or maybe even over here. It was, and widely criticized for that. But the idea was that tragedy takes place in a disoriented urban space, whereas comedy brings us closer up front in a space which is less challenging to it. That by the time of Palladio, that kind of integration of views of the city and views of what's happening on the stage has disappeared. And you get this kind of divorce between what's happening in the realm of art and what's happening, as it were, looking out into the city. To make a very, very long story short, the culmination of this divorce is in Wagner's Bayreuth. You know that Wagner built the theater in Bayreuth to perform his operas and only his operas. And this is I've actually played in the orchestra here as a nightmare, which I'm just about to describe to you. But this is what it looks like. And if you go one further, you'll see what's very distinctive about it. This has a double proscenium. That is, it's got a proscenium here, and then it's got another proscenium here. And Wagner put that double proscenium in to emphasize the fact that the stage is withdrawn from you, far, far away. It's not framing a fourth wall. It's that there's another layer between you and what you see on stage. The other thing that he's done to make this withdraw from you, which is more pertinent to us as musicians, is that we're all underneath the stage, and the hood, what's here, this bit, is there's a leather hood, so that wherever you are, you can't see musicians underneath. It's a horror because, frankly, people, sweat. It stinks. People sweat continually. There's no real air in it. But the notion is that the sound floats up from nowhere. There's a mystical abyss. That's what a mystischer Abgrund is. So that this is a space of complete dissociation between the audience, who originally sat on very hard benches. Most Wagner operas are 3.5 to 5 hours, and they sat on these benches in this temple to art, which was withdrawn from the life around them. There is absolutely no way of knowing where you are inside this theater after 3 hours. You're just lost. So that's the historic background between what I see as a tension between street space and the spaces of imagination. This is a historical setting I wanted to put this into, and I see I'm almost at the end of my time. So I'm going to hurry about this. How can we solve this? How can we make a more porous relationship between the actual life of the streets and what goes on inside the theater? One answer to this, which I've written a lot about, is in urban terms, is porosity. And what porosity means is basically that the line between the inside and the outside is porous. It works like a membrane. A membrane holds certain good aspects of the cell in, and freely takes in things from the outside and expels what's no longer useful for the cell. In other words, a membrane is not an absence of barrier. It's a particular kind of barrier. And a porous membrane in a cell, as in a city, is focused on the conditions at the edge rather than the center. The membrane condition is between cells or between spaces in the city. And that has its parallel in the design of theatrical space. And I'm going to show you some ways it does and the difficulties of it. The prototype that my colleague Andrew Todd and I worked on for theaters that could be put anywhere and cost very little money was this. These are just 4x8 plywood panels, and they can be, they make an instant theater, and they're porous in the sense that they can be closed or open. And to understand what our prototype was, how that could then be built, I'd give you the example of this is a Half Moon Theater in London, designed by Florian Bagel on the principles that Andrew Todd and I actually first showed him in these 4x8 panels. And what you can see here is that all these spaces can be closed so the theater can be shut and open. The most important of these is that the door is seldom shut. And the idea of the Half Moon Theater was you're walking along the street and you hear a theatrical performance or a dance performance going in here or a piece of music, and you just walk in. You can look at what's happening inside, and easily it's a porous membrane in that sense. There is a division from the outside, but it's completely something that you can overcome. So that is one kind of solution to this, but it doesn't get really at the idea of relating what's being performed inside to what is being performed outside. And I thought I'd like to talk a little, since Steve Tompkins is building you a new theater at Harvard in Alston, about a prior theater that he built, which is in London. It's called the Young Vic. And it is a theater which tries to make the street itself a kind of relations to the street so easy, so porous, that people will naturally go to the plays inside, which are mostly plays put on by people who live in the community. This part of London, when Steve built this, was extremely poor. Like all of London, it's now unaffordable by any of us. But when he built this, there were lots of housing estates here, a lot of people hanging out in the street, lots of drugs, and so on. And they put together, the director was David Lamb, who did this. They put together a local theater troupe, and they tried to bring people in by creating this kind of porous space. There had never been a cafe on the street like this. It was considered unsanitary that you'd have all these fumes and people would be drinking beer right next to a highway. But they managed to persevere. They also understood that to make a space really feel porous, that the vertical dimension was very important. That a simple story, one-dimensional story, was not as inviting as doing this kind of suspension over the top. So you can see how this works. When I played here, there it is. We performed there. So I tell you, as a performer, it's, you know, you're in the middle of a Beethoven quartet and somebody says, yeah, I'll have another round, you know. But that was the whole point of this, that this is a little space where the performance is happening and you're eating and drinking at the same time. It breaks, for classical music, it breaks the whole notion, which was enshrined in Beirut, that the audience, sits in silence, that it marvels at the art on stage. I would say that, well, I remember this particularly, we played the Fauré piano quartets here. A lot of the music was lost because people were, you know, eating and drinking and schmoozing and whatever here. But the notion was that instead of music, there was something actually happening. And people sort of look up like this, and from the street they'd open the doors and so on. So that is another form of porosity. And you won't get that in Harvard. Unfortunately, it didn't allow Steve to be as adventurous as he could have been. But you get something that's okay. But there are limits to porosity, and I want to explain to you a little what those are. In sonic terms, they are, I guess this is too complicated. and I have to go on. This has to do with reverberation effects. And ideally, in a hall, the reverberation effect between the back wall and the performer is 1.8 seconds. And this is how you model it so that you get that when you're making a new one. The model for it is Boston Symphony Hall, which is probably the greatest single performance space for musicians in the world. It's a perfect acoustic. I was very fortunate to play there when I was a kid, and it was incredible because you could hear people, but you could hear almost in real time what the sound you were making. That statistic, 1.8 second reverb time, is something. It was first measured by Leo Baranek at MIT, but it's an amazing experience for the audience as well. So if you want to hear that, just go to Boston Symphony Hall, even though it's, well, we won't go into that. Sight is something that is more important for you, and this is my team did this about 15 years ago when we were building a theater in Addis Ababa. And we wanted to study, we had a very poor sight, and we wanted to study the cone of vision and how we could take this very irregular poor sight and make it so that everybody could see and as well as hear from the stage. And this is you can have these slides if you want. These are the measures of what we did in order to deal with fundamentals of lighting and to bring the performer so that he or she is visible to people who are far away. And these, I'm not going to go through all of this. This is also a way of dealing with and so on. And these are quite precise measurements that need to be made in order to have illumination in a theater work well without destroying the illusion that the light comes from somewhere you can't see. And that is, I go on about this, wait a minute, go on. That is embodied, that kind of work, in probably the most brilliantly illuminated theater for music in Europe, which is the Philharmonie in Berlin. And the lighting on this means that from anywhere in this theater, you have a complete view of what's going on in below, and it's all visible to you without shadow. And it required all of those kinds of measures of the sort we did in order to make this a space which looks perfectly natural. That is, it looks as though they're just naturally as they are. In fact, it's the result of an enormous amount of calculation. And this is just a ground plan of it. But the problem is this. That's its exterior. So the kind of visual porosity on the inside is contravened by an exterior which is a disaster. Okay. I'm not going to talk about that. Now, what I want to end with on this, and I want to shut up, is how we deal with the dimensions of time in porosity. You all know this from Rahul Mehrotra, and can you tell me which city this is? I can't remember for the life of me. And it's not, but this is a temporary theater put up every year in this square. Do you remember where it is? It's somewhere in Delhi, isn't it? Mumbai? Is it Mumbai? Okay. Well, every year a theater is constructed like this, and a set of plays are put on. It can be taken up, put up and taken down, as I remember, in 4 days. So that is one kind of way of transforming the street into the stage, a very, very extreme version of it. A more interesting to me politically version of temporary theater is Toyo Ido's the Konji Public Theater in Tokyo. This is basically Toyo, this is tent fabric. And Toyo figured a way to and it's strung up interiorly with poles. And Toyo figured out a way to put up these poles and stretch the fabric over it within 3 or 4 hours, I think, and disassembled it that way. And what that means is the theater can move around from place to place. What's the value of this? Because a program in this was that this temporary theater would go to a community and show foreign plays that people had not seen. For instance, Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman previewed this way. And the notion was that it was easier to see something strange in a temporary theater than it was in a theater that was permanent. It was a brilliant insight. So what you have is a kind of social, if you like, porosity or porosity in terms of content, which is allied to the notion that the theater can travel all over the city. I find this a very beautiful form, but that's really not the point of it. And it's lit on the inside by some of the same mechanisms I showed you previously. But that is a way of understanding porosity in time correlated to the notion of the experience of difference. That's what this is, the logic of this, of something coming from the outside and then disappearing. Now, which brings me to politics, in the conclusion of this. We know about political theater, the sorts of Occupy Wall Street. It's very obvious. It is a form of advertising, just the way product advertising works. You can easily identify somebody who is enraged, just as. But a more complicated version of this kind of political theater, which is temporary, is embodied by the March on Washington, the famous the famous march at which Martin Luther King gave the I Have a Dream speech. And this is, I'm sorry, my photograph is dreadful here. This is what it looked like. Nearly 800,000 people around the central plaza and so on. What you don't understand from looking at a photo like this is the art that it took to assemble this. One of the things is that porosity exists at the edges here. Rather than kettling people forward to this, these edges on the side were, there are lots of spaces where people could enter from the side, like coming out from wings onto a central stage. And that was important politically because it meant that there was so much kind of amorphous and ambiguous movement that the police could not control this crowd without the help of the organizers themselves. So if you were from Memphis, your bus would park, say, over here, and you would then meld into the crowd by a door here. Somebody from Washington, the state of Washington, over here, something like that. In other words, it's a space with wings that creates this center. And more, even more important, when the crowds were marshaled in, they were given signs that this was, after all, a march for racial justice. but the word race is seldom mentioned here. And the reason is that the organizer, who I'm going to tell you about in a moment, wanted a sign that anybody could hold. What he said is a mask, a sign is like a mask. It's something that anybody can wear. So these signs, as people were streamed in, they were given these signs which were about freedom and full employment rather than being black, you know? And that made it possible to mix this, lots of white faces here. Now, why do I say this is a work of art? Well, there's a very particular reason for it, and it's embodied by this man, Bayard Rustin. Here he is with Martin Luther King. Bayard Rustin was a gay communist in the 30s. In fact, he went to jail for homosexual offenses, horror of horrors. And King, almost none of the kind of elite of the civil rights movement wanted to have him there, gay, black, you know. They wanted to be people who were normal. Communist, terrible. King defended Rustin and said, no, we need him. And the reason we need him is that he knows about theater. Rustin actually studied to be a singer. He was a very skillful singer. He sang in a Bach choir. He studied stage movement subsequently. He was a man of theater brought in to essentially organize the March on Washington. And he did it using, and this is explained in my book at satisfyingly great detail at length, by looking at some of the ways of creating illusion that and a sense of being in a special place, unlike the street, that were employed in theaters like Bayreuth, to actually bring them out in the public, making wings, giving people costumes, but most of all, creating a kind of magical space that was nothing like the streets they had left. And it is one of the great pieces of political theater in that sense, organized in order to give a sense that we're all one. And as I say, King was his defender, and rightly so. So just to conclude about this, what I've said in this lecture is mostly emphasizing the role of a conscious creator in creating a space which is divorced from the street or reimagines the street, as in the case of the March on Washington. Now I'm going to argue against myself just for a moment. We should always do this. This is a place of theater which has no designer. This is Nehru Place in Delhi. What you're seeing is the roof of an underground parking garage. And what's here is a market in illicit electronics, you know, the kinds of things that iPhones that fell off the back of a truck, you know, that sort of thing, sold by two groups, by Muslims and by Hindus. It is the safest place in where these two groups meet in Delhi. It has very low crime rates, interethnic crime rates. It's a porous edge in a space which nobody designed. That's why I'm saying it's an argument against me. The actors here are goods. But unlike this kind of tourist-orientated theater, this kind of stage set is one in which as in any market, people are saying, oh, my beautiful iPhone here, so cheap. For you, I have a special price, all of that sort of stuff, in which Muslims and Hindus are competing with each other, and yet they do so very peacefully. And the reason for that is that the theater itself gives a kind of ritualized structure to how competition can take place in a complex space. And this is an alternative model for thinking about how we might build, as I say, it's an argument against the argument I've been making to you. But the takeaway I'd like you to have from this talk is that rather than verbal, that the urban political domain is embodied and spatial. That's the level at which we should be thinking about theater, not what's said in it, but how it's spatially organized. That's the politics that we can build. And in my view, it's a more important politics than the verbal realm, which is an argument I make in my book. That essentially the verbal realm of politics is exhausted. It's debased. And to bring people together, we need to do, in my view, more of the kinds of things that Bayard Rustin did in making the March on Washington. And perhaps there's a way that even as designers, we could make something like Nehru Space, although as I say, I wanted to present it as a counter-argument, as a space that was made by no artist, which nonetheless has the function of being a theater, with all the fantasy of such a beautiful iPhone. No one has ever had an iPhone like this. You know, all of that. And the arousal of theater. So that's pretty much where my book begins and this talk ends. Thank you very much. Shall we? Okay. Oh, good. So we'll talk for about 15 minutes?
Yeah, thank you so much. People are running out. Don't leave yet. No. Maybe I'll just make. Thank you so much for that talk. I'm just going to make one or two comments, maybe one comment and one question, and then we want to open it out to the audience. And maybe, I mean, it's going to be really important to open it out to the audience because here I am moderating this. I don't know anything about building design, even though I teach here. Of course, I'm learning about it, but I'm going to come back to thinking about scales of the kind of, that you went through so many scales in your talk, and there are going to be, I'm sure, a lot of questions from the audience, particularly about your great analysis of all these stage spaces and porosity, et cetera. I guess that my first comment, I have a comment and then a question. The first comment, it was like, I've read the book, I love the book, a lot of these elements are in the book. I started feeling like I wanted to push back at you when you got to the last slide with the market. And even though you talked about that as a kind of, as a self-reflection of your own argument, because I started to think if that site of informal vending, and it's probably some combination of formal and informal vending, whether really the notion of theater was the right notion for describing that place. And it just raised a question to me about what we mean by theater, not performance. I love the idea of performance, but the notion of theater. And to build on that comment, and I'm hoping you're going to respond to this too, it pushes me back to my introduction, and maybe I just have one way of reading and understanding so much of your work, but I'm just wondering why this is not about public space as opposed to the notion of theater, and I'm sure you're going to have an answer. You are speaking to all those elements in all the examples, in a way, starting with the Agora, starting with some of the original historical stuff, and ending with Bayard Rustin. To me, I'm thinking, okay, this is about spaces where public ideas are debated and discussed. So that's kind of, I want that hovering around, whether this is a narrative and a story about public space and what's the role of performance in that. The question, which might also link to that, has to do with the fact that you gave us a wonderful historical evolution of how these spaces have changed. These theaters have changed along with modernization, if I dare use that word, going way back to really early medieval, or the Greeks through medieval periods, and then you jumped up to the present. The sociologist in me is thinking about the historical evolution of norms, of kind of relations, of power, of money, monarchy, etc. So there's an evolution of these things. So I'm convinced that if we think historically about the evolution of societies, the idea of what's a public space and what's not a public space is changing in these times. And again, the Agora was so interesting because the discussion about whether there's a performance and a discussion about whether one should go to war, etc., those are really public issues that are on that liminal kind of, on a stage liminally between performing ideas but with public input. And then over time, it becomes more separated. What individuals get to in the public, how they drive major societal issues changes over time. It may not be the reality, but that's kind of the idea in your talk. So if that's true, this is really about where we have come from and where we're heading with respect to what spaces allow us to be public and to push back against power. Right? And you talked about politics. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about that question. Where are the spaces that we need to recover, and are they theaters, or are these other more insurgent, ephemeral spaces? A little more on that question, because I know you've written about that. And if you could answer that with respect to the city, and not just the building itself, I would love to hear about that.
Okay. That's a tall order. Well, what I'd say about this is, and you know this from your reading in urban theory, or I hope you do, that the distinction between theatrical and public is one that's drawn between Walter Benjamin and Jürgen Habermas. For Benjamin, all public space is a space of display, which is silent. That's the whole point of excavating the poetry of Baudelaire for him, that it's a space in which everybody is a spectator. And for Habermas, that's exactly what a public realm isn't. It's a space in which there are no performers and spectators. There are discussants back and forth. It's why Habermas's public space is it's actually quite interesting about when Twitter first came on, he thought this was it. This would be the ideal public realm. People talk back and forth. Poor thing, he never could conceive someone like Elon Musk, but that it made sense in terms of a space of communicative interaction. I think that's a wonderful idea, but the performative space is a space in which you are silently looking around you and you're aroused by things which are out of the way. So they're performances of something that's not normal routine. And that's a distinction I would make. I mean, Benjamin much more compelling to me than the Habermasian version for cities. Let me ask you, does it make sense to you? Are there any Habermasians here? No, that's good. But that's how that plays out. The market is, in Benjamin's terms, of course, it's the ultimate. It's a diorama. Remember that when he does this part of the Paris Arcades book? It's a diorama. They happen to be cell phones, stolen cell phones, and I tell you a little what this market is like. Because there's a parking garage underneath, there are fumes coming up continually through the air vents. It smells dreadful. Delhi is pretty polluted anyhow, but it's incredible. Yet it's packed with people who want to see what's going on in the market, and if they can get like a cheap, not necessarily an iPhone, but a cell phone cord or something like that. There are no fixed prices of anything, as is true for all informal markets. It's whatever you can, the traffic will bear. And there's a lot of hawking, that is, people trying to personify the goods they have. That's theater. That's not going into an Apple, well, the Apple Store is a bad example, but going into a supermarket where everything is laid out, take it or leave it. You know, it's a different relationship to commerce. It's a much more aggressive relation to commerce than the sort of sweetness of Faneuil Hall, which is, it looks like a market, but it isn't a market because there's no human interaction. Except, the prices are all fixed. The stalls are not competing with each other like, oh, he has terrible stuff, I have the better stuff, which is the way a real market works. So that's to me, that's a difference on this. I also think, and I take it as read, that you can have lots of theatrics in a small town. You don't need a large city in order to do this, but what you do need is a realm in which people can diverge from the ordinary, from routine. That's when theater begins, when there's something that is provoked either by a person or by an activity that's out of the ordinary.
We want to make sure people have an opportunity to ask questions. So if you have a question, put your hand up. Are we running around with microphones? Yeah, here. Right here. But I do, while we're sitting over, I want to say it's interesting you responded comparing that more informal sitting to Faneuil Hall. That's exactly why I evoked the idea of kind of modernization and fixed functional places. Everything has its own place and there's an ordering to it. And there's a little more disruption, a little more spontaneity in these other forms. But anyway, let's hear questions.
I think that's actually a great segue and kind of gets at, some of my question here. When I think about performance, generally, spectacle, whether it is public, whether it is transactional, whether it is a stadium and a street, I think about entrance and egress, the moment of arrival upon a space. I think that grand entry in a lot of cases, takes place through some of that porosity that you talk about. And I certainly recognize the importance of that. I'm curious to know, from your perspective, whether the type of porosity that is exhibited through design and form, in your experience, has influenced the way that such space is experienced. Whether that porosity is consistent and predictable versus polyrhythmic, let's say?
That's a very good question, and it actually impinges on the work I've been doing at the UN, which has been pretty much centered the last decade, really, on how to create public spaces in which people who are normally at each other's throats can coexist physically. And there are, I'm going to answer your question. It's a serious question. I'm going to give you a serious answer to it. What it depends on is that those points of contact between groups be very, very superficial at first. If you start, I give an example when we were working in Beirut, the first kind of porous spaces that we dealt with were totally minor. They were places for people to get fresh drinking water. There was nothing, little fountains and things like that, because the city had lost them. And what planning can do is widen the palette over time of what are the resources that are bringing people together in the same space. For instance, you might start with a drinking fountain and then add a little health clinic next to it. Or in India, a public toilet. But it's a very, it's something that outsiders can help with, but it really takes a lot of knowledge on the ground to know how you can open up these spaces of porosity. I'll give you an example of a failure that I had in that regard. I don't know how well you all know New York City, but on the east side, you know, up in, this was 20 years ago when I made this dreadful mistake. One of the richest parts of New York went to 96th Street on the east side, and then one of the poorest parts above 96th Street was Spanish Harlem. And when I was working as a planner in New York, we wanted to build a market called a marqueta for the Spanish community. We made a horrible error. We put it in the center of Spanish Harlem, rather than putting it on 96th Street between this very rich and very poor space. Why was that an error? Because just physically being in the presence of someone who is different is enormously important in creating a kind of livable public realm. If your employer and you are both standing in line for a quart of milk, your relations, even if you don't speak to each other or anything like that, your relations are far different than having meetings of committees on Spanish American, Jewish American relationships, you know? It's very visceral, and that's why the whole notion of designing porosity is important. What you say about entrances and exits in that regard is very, very important. If you concentrate everything inside a building, then you're making an error. Whereas if there are lots of small, when we put a dental clinic next to this space in Beirut, the dental clinic had its own door, even though it was part of a huge building. You may think, how trivial. But in fact, that meant that people could enter and exit this shared space in a way that was very discreet. So, I mean, to me, the problem of urbanism is, and it goes back to the whole notion of doing districts, you know, of making maps that are perfectly clear, all of that, is that it defeats the purpose of making a public realm, which is creating this kind of amorphous, crackled fabric, which people can inhabit and leave and exit from. And that, I think of that in political terms, that's democratic space. That's a space of participation. Whereas a space where this is, this is our space, it's nobody else's space, it's a space of identity. That's not a democratic space. So that's in this book that thanks to Ken Stewart, will see the light of day in September. That's a big issue for me in that book. Do you agree with that?
So we probably have time for one more question.
Oh.
Question from the audience?
Yeah, disagree with me. I love to argue.
Microphone there.
Oh, thank you. Hello, I'm Ricardo Escobar. I am from El Salvador, and I'm a sports designer here in Boston. That's my specialty. So right now, we're about to host, well, Paris is about to host the Summer Olympics. And for the first time in history, the opening ceremony is going to be in the Seine River instead of the Olympic Stadium, because they knew that they needed this porosity to connect the games with the Parisians, right? So my question for you is like, what do you think that should be the right relationship of a stadium and a city or a neighborhood? Because we saw the Dionysius Theater example. So what do you think it should be the right amount of?
I've never thought about it. It's a really interesting question. I know what it shouldn't be, which is what we did in London, which is there's no connection at all. But I hadn't thought about the reverse. What do you think it should be?
Well, I think that the idea of taking the games outside an enclosed space is a total success. Like now the river has been cleaned up, and now the river is like a relationship with the Parisians and the games itself. So people now can swim in the river. The opening, like, there will be dancers in the river. Yeah. The regatta will be at the river. That now the water was so contaminated that only boats can be on the river.
Yeah, that's all good. But this in Paris, this goes this kind of remaking goes way back to Anne Hidalgo's. The moment she came in, the notion was that that somehow this center of Paris, colonized by cars, had meant in particular that this center, that this was a space that people from the periphery should be able to come into, poor people that is, and rather than sort of bleed into, there's a ceinture around Paris, this big highway, bleed into the center from that they should be able to go directly to the Seine, and that should be a sociable space. And that was been in the making for a long time. And New York has we did a kind of modest version of that on the West Side Highway. But it's an interesting planning problem. I know this is nothing to my talk, but since I know about this problem, I'll say a little too about it. The notion is that what you want to do is make the center of the city, well, actually it does have to do with my talk. You want Times Square to be inhabited by New Yorkers. You want the center to be a place which is accessible to everyone. And to do that, what you have to do is some fairly radical interventions, what Anne did was, you know, she decided she was going to close this highway on the on the right side of the Seine. What we didn't do in Times Square, the reason we failed with this, is that we didn't extend commercial rent control to the buildings around Times Square, so that as it gentrified, you know, the usual story, the rents went up. The small businesses that were intermixed with the whorehouses and little manufactories and craft shops, they were all forced out. But it is a different notion of the relation of the center to the periphery, which is not radial, but as it were, you know, jumping in to the center. I think if, in hindsight about New York, if we didn't sort of know what we were doing very much, but we would have taken little nodes of it, which were problem areas like 46th and Broadway, and just dealt with those nodes together. It was a kind of the center of the whorehouse district. And very dangerous, because a lot of the people who were sex workers were selling drugs at that time as well. We would have focused on little nodes like that for intervention, but protected the rest. But that takes a lot of local knowledge, you know, and but it's a different strategy than this notion of seepage in from the exterior into the center. It's a real big planning problem. Didn't we once have a studio about the periphery and center here? Probably before our time, or your time. Anyhow, well, it's. I'll sign books if you want to. If you want me to do that, I want to drink.
All right, we hear you on. I do want to thank you for that last question, because it allowed Richard, in a way, to kind of come full circle in this talk, which is I loved hearing you talk about the urban scale, the design scale. But you started with the building scale, yet you're using principles that you looked at, porosity, et cetera, in the building scale of the design of these theaters to apply to the city as a stage. As you quote in your book, Shakespeare, all the world's a stage, but the city is the stage on which so many of your insights are unfolding. And thanks again for sharing your time with us here this evening, and thanks everybody for coming.
Thank you.